Greetings chess fans, my name is Arturs Neiksans, I'm the leading Latvian chess grandmaster and I'm continuing the video series about teaching you some important chess concepts in under 10 minutes. Today's episode I'm gonna show you how to play a simple setup against white's e4 and this is the Caro-Kann defense. So here we play c6, our idea is to play d5, fight for the center and then think about how to bring out the last bishop and obviously castle short. Now here are many continuations at white's disposal, but mainly three continuations dominate at the club level. So they are the moves d4, d5 and e5. They are the moves e takes on d5, c takes on d5 and whatever happens after that, or also the classical variation of the Caro-Kann with knight c3. So let's start from the very beginning and see what happens if white plays the main line. So white plays d4, you play d5, and your idea is you want to take the pawn on e4. So naturally white has a number of ways to respond to this. For example, white goes this idea d5. Now this comes from the professional level because space advantage is a very big concept nowadays. So you have to bring out the last bishop because in this position it's the troublesome piece. So you want to bring it out somewhere on f5 and then in the future couple of moves you want to play e6, c5, knight c6 and play it like a French defense except your bishop on c8 is not locked, it's out. So that's why here you want to bring it out, you want to play bishop f5, you want to play e6, c5, knight c6, think of a way to develop your kingside pieces, but there's of course a couple of tricks. Make sure you're not falling for some ideas like h4, e6 would be really terrible because this is what many people miss from the black's perspective. g4, h5, and your bishop is trapped. By the way, the same idea also happens if your opponent plays knight c3 or he plays h4. He just wants to trap the bishop, so again e6 is still a playable move, but you're going to have to know how to respond meaningfully here. h5, knight f4, bishop h7, give up the pawn on h5 to play c5, knight c6, queen b6, and try to cause a lot of craziness in the center. But still, I mean, at the club level, people don't play like that. And the most played continuation is either knight f3, bishop d3, or the bishop d3 right away. So your idea here is pretty simple. You take it, you always keep a close eye on the positional pawn sacrifice, because this would make your kingside development incredibly difficult to carry out. So you play e6, and after knight f3, now you're thinking of some simple ways to continue development like c5, you want to play knight c6, let's say white goes here, knight c6 castles, a simple trade at some point, and now probably a good idea to include this h6 to make sure there's no knight g5 or bishop g5 ideas. And if white does something like this, you bring out the knight, you play bishop e7, you play short castle, you play queen b6, you try to apply some pressure, you play rook c8, and just see basically what happens. So when you look at this position from the black's perspective, it feels like an improved French defense. So you don't have this last bishop on c8 because you just traded it. Now naturally there's a couple of other combinations from the white's disposal. After bishop f5, there's the very popular combination white can play stuff like knight f3. Now you see g4 no longer is a problem, so you can just play e6 here and think of a way to continue your development of the kingside, like bishop g6, knight f5, bishop e7, castles, c5 and knight c6. Now there's naturally some other continuations as well. Now instead of the move e5, white can also play e takes on d5. E takes on d5, this is the so-called exchange variation, and after c takes on d5, still your core idea is to play knight c6 and bring out the bishop on c8 as quickly as possible. So the main combination of this line is that white typically starts with bishop d3, knight c6 and c3. Now this is what we call the cusp structure. So what white is trying to do, white is trying to play against your last bishop, because again if you play something like e6, then your bishop on c8, quite similarly to the French defense, is not feeling really that great. And you could play f5 for bishop g4. So what do? You play knight f6, you initiate the bishop g4 idea. This is, by the way, typical way how you can bring the bishop in the game. White goes here. Now, you can play bishop g4, bring the bishop on g6, followed by e6 and bishop d6, but I find it to be a much simpler combination that you simply play g6. It doesn't come with the idea to play bishop g7. The idea is far more simpler. You want to play bishop f5 and trade off the bishops right away. So if white trades off the bishops here, it seems that you have double the pawns, but actually it's not a big deal, because now not only you have an open a g-file here for your rook, you're actually thinking about bishop d7, queen c7, a long castle. So let's say white goes knight e2, bishop d6 and knight e5. You play queen c7, long castle, rook g8, knight e4 for a very simple game. Then maybe after knight e4, f6, e5, you're very aggressive at the king side. At the club level still, I mean, this is not really that popular. A far more popular continuation is a simple developing move like knight f3. You continue with knight c6 and knight c3. And if you know your common idea that you have to bring out the last bishop before securing the center with e6, you're going to be good. So the simplest continuation here is just to play bishop g4. Let's say white does something like this. You play e6, you want to bring the bishop on d6, and then see what to do with the knight. So typically the knight stands well here in f6, but maybe also knight g7 with the bishop on d6 gives you interesting ideas to go for f6 and e5. Yeah, so maybe this is something you can explore. Either way here, black's game is really simple, and this is not how white is fighting for advantage. Now, quite a classical combination for white is also the move knight c3. Now you see, you're simply running out to freeze the moves because, I mean, if you don't take on e4, you have problems with your last pair bishop's development, and knight f6, as tempting as it may be, after e5, you're losing time. So your knight cast move again, it's not really so many squares where you can put the knight without seriously damaging your position. So that's why here we have to take it. After d takes on e4, knight takes on e4, you can bring out the bishop on f5. This is the so-called old main line, but nowadays a very popular setup is knight f6. I'm suggesting knight f6 because you're going to use this continuation also against the two knights variation, which I'm about to show you. So the point here is to kill white's knight on e4, and if white takes on f6, you want to play e takes on f6 and simply continue normal development like bishop d6, show castle, rook e8, bring the knight to f8, bring the bishop on e6, you have just a nice development. Do not worry about your double pawns, there's definitely far more dangerous things that can happen to you in an opening, and this position has a very good reputation. For example, white goes like knight f3, bishop d6, bishop d3, you just castle, you play bishop g4, bring the knight on d7, bring the rook on e8, sometimes you play g6 f5 to give the knight on d7 a potential route to go to f6 and possibly even e4. There's also the so-called two knights variation. So the two knights variation can start with either knight c3 or knight f3. So for example, white goes here knight f3 d5 or knight c3, or white goes knight c3 d5 and knight f3. Now here, again, you can play bishop g4 to solve the problem of your last bishop and give it up on f3, but I find it to be a simpler continuation just to take on e4. So the point is, again, white basically has to take it, you play knight f6, and again, we're happy to take with e-pawn should white take on f6. For example, knight takes on f6, e takes on f6. Again, your idea is really simple. Bishop d6, show castle, bishop g4, knight e7, see what happens. And instead, if white tries to do something funny as queen e2, please do not fall for this terrible trick with knight bd7, which is a pretty reasonable idea. I mean, you want to take on e4, you want to play knight f6, but this is a known trap. That's a maiden one. So, yeah, simply don't go here. And the best continuation here for black is just to take on e4, play queen e5, offer a queen trade, and if white tries to dodge it, after queen f4, you can just hunt the queen and basically checkmate it. You get the queens off the board, you play g6, bishop g7, you figure it out. The same applies also if the white queen goes to h4, doesn't really change much. You can start maybe with a check here, checkmating the queen, trade the queens, g6, bishop g7, give your bishop along the diagonal, you're doing great. There's some other lesser continuations that are being explored. For example, this so-called fantasy variation after d4, d5, and f3. So what White is trying to do, White is trying to trick you into unfamiliar position and again play against your light square bishop. I find it to be the simplest combination, that you just play e6. You are making your bishop look pretty bad, but the big idea is to play d takes on e4, queen h4, and just win the pawn on e4. So if White goes here, you play bishop e4. Again, you want to take on c3, you want to take on e4, win the pawn. And if White reacts, let's say in a way something like e5, you can always find a way for your light square bishop to join the game with b6, bishop a6, and the kingside knight goes to e7. Now, naturally, there's more than that, more continuations than these, but I think that it's going to give you pretty good insight how to treat the Caro-Kann. It's a very solid repertoire with a good reputation, and in case you're curious about learning about this very solid defense more, I have made quite a fresh bootcamp which is lasting about 3 hours. Go check out, and of course in the meantime, if you like the video, please do not forget to press like, leave your comments, and consider subscribing to my channel. Arturs signing off.